Well, back in 84 to 86, I had a 2-year research leave from here, and I was at Massachusetts Mental Health Center working on a number of projects. But I was part of a research team in psychiatry and law, and it was led by a group of forensic psychiatrists. I'd been interested in mental patients' rights. That was a large part of my dissertation research and subsequent research when I started teaching and researching here in 1980. One of the psychiatrists there, Ed Mickelson, had been retained by the lawyers as an expert witness for the Woburn families in the toxic waste case there around childhood leukemia. And every week at the meetings, we would update each other on our work, and one day it was his turn to report on it, and we got into a very interesting discussion. So he was looking at whether or not there was depression and or PTSD as a result of exposure to all the chemicals there. And it was a very interesting discussion. He asked me, did I know of survey research by sociologists looking at the effects of toxics on communities. At that point, there was fairly little, but I gave it to him, and we talked more and more and started to think, we should write something about this. And next thing I knew, there was a book in the works. So that was how it started. It was just a very intriguing case. These people that we met there had been through an enormous amount, and he had interviewed them already, so he had great entree to them because they trusted him pretty much as a doctor. Even though he was getting their information to use in court, they were also venting to him. And so by the time I got there, I conducted my interviews with him present, although they were all my interviews. And plus we had a lot of access. The lawyer, Jan Schlichtman, was very supportive of the whole project, and he thought it would actually help the case as well, get more information that way, even though I was never working on any retainer for the lawyers. But he asked them, please make yourself open to Phil. He's going to come talk to you. It's going to help all of us. And so they were very welcoming. And the more time I spent with them, the more I was completely sucked into this whole new area. I had never done any research in the environment. I had, when I think back to it, I was an inveterate newspaper clipper, and I had alphabetical clips of all sorts of things, and I did have things on toxic waste, and I had remembered a whole lot of important environmental events that had happened, and certainly remember all the political discussions around Earth Day in 1970. Was this the best way to go? Was this taking us away from other things like civil rights, anti-war movement, women's movement? People really were having those debates. I don't think we all understood, even in 1970, 40 years ago, how important that Earth Day was. But it all just sort of gelled together, and I realized that I was now looking at something very similar to what I'd done with mental patients' rights. Dispossessed people with few legal rights, little legal recourse, a little access to power, and a lot of lay people getting science on their own, really understanding. In the case of mental patients, they were understanding a lot about the side effects of psychotropics. They were understanding certainly the legal and the policy issues. And the patients' rights activists, had generated a lot of policy changes as well in terms of legal rights for patients who used to have less rights than prisoners. So I saw the same thing happening with all these toxic waste activists. Well, the first thing was they had to even recognize that there was a cluster. And it was very accidental because they met at an oncology clinic down in Boston where their kids were going, because there weren't any high-level facilities up in Woburn for them to go to. And so they met in the waiting room and understood there was a cluster, and then they began to ask questions and came up with a lot of obstacles from the State Department of Health, the Department of Public Health, and they didn't get any help from the federal agencies either. And they didn't know where to go, so they had to develop a lot of knowledge on their own. And there was a history of concern about water quality there. People could taste and smell it, and there had been a history of complaints to the water department, but nothing ever came of it. So they had a little bit of that to start to piece together, but the main thing was that they knew it was a big industrial area, and they knew something was going on, and they felt it was very likely connected to the water. So they were invited to give this talk at the Harvard School of Public Health, and Marvin Zelen and Steve Lugakos were sitting in on that talk, and they were very, very taken with it. You know, the same way that I was taken with the story when I heard it from Ed Mickelson. Ann Anderson was a complete grassroots activist, no background in science, no background in politics, but just a good-hearted person. And she was very much like Lois Gibbs, a quiet, ordinary person who, when motivated by kids' health issues and the obstacles that government put in her way and the corporate obstacles, became a tiger and really organized well and went door to door and got people involved. And so, you know, Lugakos and Zelen said, you know, we think that we could do a study to show that a number of health effects, not just leukemia in the children, were associated with water. And we need your help, though, because we don't have any money to do this. We don't have time to write a grant to get that. We have a little bit of money in some account that we could use, you know, but nothing to do a big study. You've got to get a lot of volunteers out there doing these questionnaires with people. And that's what happens. They were able to mobilize a lot of residents and also a number of people who were students and at the Harvard School of Public Health, and other people in various ways were involved doing the questions. And they eventually got to around 50% of people with telephone numbers in Woburn, which in those days, I mean, Woburn is a largely working class, lower middle class city. Probably most everybody had a phone. You know, it isn't like today in a very poor area, you don't like to do phone surveys because you know you're going to underrepresent the poorest. And, you know, it was a very large database, and it was, you know, statistically strong enough to show the connections between the water from the contaminated sites, from Grace and Beatrice, into the water pipes, and to see how they moved into people's homes and what levels of exposure people had and how they clustered in certain neighborhoods. But Ann Anderson was just, you know, tremendous as one of endless people that I've studied. Many I've met and worked with, but others I've read about and known about through others. No science background, no political background. They just become completely involved because they know no one else will protect our health, our family's health, our surroundings unless we do it. I had actually read this book that Adeline Levine, one of the first sociologists to write about the environment, wrote about Love Canal, with the title Love Canal. And she was a faculty member at Buffalo. Love Canal exploded around her. And she said, I've got to take my students out there and have this, the case study for our course this year. It wasn't the course of the environment. There were no environmental sociology courses at that time, but she was very committed to this and did a great job of getting her students to interview everybody and to look at the process as it went through the local health authorities, the New York State Department of Health, and looking at all the organizing. And, you know, it was a very big deal. She wrote this book, and I read it, and I said, you know, I have a name for this. If it were me, I would call this popular epidemiology. And this was a period of time where we were using the term popular a lot. You know, so popular this, popular that. It meant that people were involved. It was like a grassroots lay kind of approach to life. And it's like it just stayed in my brain for a long time until we began to interview the people in Woburn. And of course what they were doing there was they were working with scientists at the Harvard School of Public Health to conduct this very large-scale epidemiological study. And it meant that they were going out interviewing people about their exposures and their proximity to the water system and other things of that sort. So they were engaging in science, and they were doing what other people have called creekside epidemiology, barefoot epidemiology. I got to bring in my term, popular epidemiology. It just fit perfectly because they had an enormous amount of scientific impact in that study. So the public paradigm I take this idea from Shelley Krimsky, who is a wonderful environmental scholar at Tufts at the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy. And he wrote a book called Hormonal Chaos. And this was social science and technology studies approach to looking at how the endocrine disruptor hypothesis had grown and become accepted. And it really starts with Theo Colborn and Pete Myers and Diane Dumanovsky in their book, Our Stolen Future, which is a wonderful book, and they have a website in which they continue to update this work. They were fighting against the dominant paradigm, which didn't understand that endocrine disruptors were important and that many of the chemicals that we're concerned about were acting as endocrine disruptors in people's bodies and animals' bodies as well. So Theo Colborn, sort of like Rachel Carson, tied together a lot of evidence from disparate studies and showed a real trend in science that endocrine disruptors were very prevalent in our environment and that they were having a lot of harmful effects. Shelley Krimsky then looked at how this played out, how it spread. So instead of synthesizing the science, he was looking at how the science spread out to the public, to the legislatures, to everybody else concerned with it. And he had this idea of a public hypothesis, so that a scientific hypothesis now is being discussed in public, that the average layperson, that the average educated professional, whether it was a lawyer or a legislator, could take part in this. It wasn't only at the laboratory bench. And so I like the idea then of that, and having worked with Shelley a lot, I borrowed this with much credit to him and called it the public paradigm, where people were helping to form new paradigms by working together in these collectivities, sometimes formal collectivities, collaborations between researchers and citizens groups, and sometimes more informal, almost what we call invisible colleges, groups of people with like-minded ideas working together to put forth a new innovative direction. So this notion of the dominant epidemiological paradigm is not that there's always a monolithic paradigm, a singular view that says disease is caused by these factors, but there generally tend to be well-accepted ideas, beliefs, and opinions. So for instance, and that can sometimes be a good one. Now we understand a very clear relationship between tobacco and lung cancer. We understand a very clear relationship between lead and various kinds of developmental disabilities, lowered IQ, neurological and other systems damages. We didn't know that previously, and so we had a sense that, for instance, many of the things that looked strange to us in Gulf War illness were psychiatric as opposed to related to chemicals. Or even with asthma, this is a very good example. When I began this, there was only the beginnings of an understanding that air pollution was a very important cause of exacerbation of asthma attacks, and later on it would become even a cause, not just an exacerbation of existing asthma. With breast cancer, people felt that it was diet, that if you thought about environmental things, that radiation, yes, but that not in terms of toxic chemicals. So it wasn't just that scientists felt that way, but the policymakers also. So they weren't regulating chemicals looking for that. The funding agencies were not funding research to make those connections. The foundations weren't doing educational work around that. The health organizations like the American Cancer Society weren't doing education and advocacy around environmental causes. So everybody basically was seeing breast cancer as genetic, as a very limited number of other causes such as radiation. But they were very antagonistic to the notion that there were environmental factors involved. And so all the popular magazines then follow that, the scientific journals follow that, the medical school curriculum follows that. And if you look at this dominant epidemiological paradigm, it shows you that throughout science, throughout public media, throughout the educational apparatus, the funding apparatus, all these different elements that make up a belief system and a knowledge system were antagonistic to an environmental cause. Well, this is something that medical sociologists have looked at all along, and it tends to be similar to a dominant epidemiological paradigm. It's the idea that you have typically a single cause for a single disease, and that you only look at those kinds of approaches, whether they be very macro, in other words, sewage spills, and then there's a likelihood of infectious diseases, or at molecular level, that a certain chemical can cause a certain DNA break. But it doesn't necessarily look at all of the other environmental factors that could be part of that. It doesn't look at what medicine now has understood very much to be the importance of social stress and social supports in mediating illness. And recovery from various illnesses is also profoundly affected by the social networks that you're in, the kinds of stigma that you face or don't face. And so the critics of the biomedical model wanted to say, yes, of course there are clear issues in infectious and chronic disease that can be seen biologically and biochemically, but there are so many other things that make up this complex. And at first, these were very obscure ideas back when, in the 60s, when people like René Dubos were writing about this, and some of the first work on stress was coming out. And now we understand the importance of that. So people's levels of stress and social support, the environment they're in, the epigenetic effects of a chemical that, in tandem with a DNA break or damage, can lead to a profoundly larger impact than just that DNA damage alone. We're beginning to see a much wider range of causes. So the critique of the biomedical model was to say, let's look broader. Well, we talked about popular epidemiology, the idea that lay people look at things around them and see that something is going on, either a disease cluster. In rural areas, people who fish a lot will notice either the absence of fish that they always knew, or they'll see a fish kill. People will smell the release of hydrogen sulfide when petroleum wastes are being dumped in a deep injection well. There are all these things that they see, smell, and notice because they are aware of their natural environment. And then they call this to the attention of other co-residents, to sympathetic professionals, to health officials, to legislators, and seek knowledge, study, redress, regulation. Critical epidemiology is a concept more the way that epidemiologists as scientists think about this. How can they look at epidemiology in a more complex way than just how one or several factors cause a disease? So they begin to look at what would be the sources of the chemicals that they're concerned with, what would be the barriers to understanding, why would government agencies be reluctant to find evidence for this? Why would corporations be trying to counter this with their own, what we now call tobacco science? Well, I'm gathering you probably got that from Living Downstream, which was one of the greatest books ever written about this, and recently revised, and a beautiful movie was made of it, which I don't know if you've seen, but it had its premiere in Boston several months back, and Sandra Steingraber was there to talk about it along with the filmmaker. And it doesn't cover everything in the book, but it covers a large chunk of it, and she actually does travel back to the parts of Illinois where she writes about, and to speak with her family and to give that really personal first-hand knowledge of it. But in Living Downstream, She argues, we have this old public health paradigm that you've got to go upstream to get the causes rather than wait downstream to treat the problem, whether it's an illness or an endangered species or anything else. And so the idea of living downstream is that we all live downstream from some contamination going on upstream. It was a classic story, it's the cardinal approach to public health, and one of the ways public health always defines itself as different from medicine, that we want to prevent disease, not just come in and treat it. So this is actually another one of those wonderful terms that Shelley Krimsky talked about in Hormonal Chaos, because he understood that the scientists really had to be advocates. They couldn't just stay in the laboratory and hope that their papers would get widespread. And this is actually what a lot of sociologists of science understand, that all scientists, Bruno Latour studied this, at some very famous laboratories. You've got to take your work and promote it. You can't just wait for it to somehow get filtered into the mainstream. And so there's always this idea that scientists are these completely neutral people who just publish their papers, but they don't. They actually go around and they try to convince others that you should talk about this in the newspapers, you should give a new appropriation to start a new federal agency, or you should give more money to the National Cancer Institute because of what we're doing. So scientists are always, in a sense, advocates for something or other. And in this case, the advocacy scientists are people working on endocrine disruptors and trying to make sure that more knowledge of that gets out so that we begin to regulate and, when necessary, to ban some of these. And it sometimes scares people that scientists would wind up being advocates, but the truth is that they always are. So this is, in a sense, just saying we're going to call the thing for what it is, that people have always done this. And it's similar to saying what the right wing says, well, these are activist judges. Well, all judges are activists. I mean, if the judge is taking an anti-reproductive rights stand, they're being activists on that side. But why is that not being an activist judge? Well, again, it's sort of like we talked about with judges. Many scholars are activists, although they might not call themselves that. So if you were a sociologist who studied population, demographer, the odds are that you would be supporting some kind of reproductive rights. That doesn't mean you'd be out there demonstrating, but it means that you would think that your data could be widely used by the Guttmacher Institute or by the United Nations, by the World Health Organization, to help spread contraception in places where people wanted to have access to that. And that you wanted to do education around STDs to prevent the spread of HIV and other STDs. That's a kind of activism. It's like we're not just studying what is the rate of HIV in a population of people between this age and of this particular tribal origin. We want to use that information to make the world better, to help prevent disease, prevent problems. If an environmental scientist sees the corals are being bleached and 10% of the corals are only left healthy, they don't want to just study this and say, oh, I've got a great new way of simulating or showing coral bleaching. I've got a great new camera that can go down and get these close-up photos, or I've got a new sampling method that's wonderful to find out what nutrients are dumping into the waters nearby that are causing this. I want to use this for a practical reason. And the truth is that most scientists, whether they be social scientists, life scientists, natural scientists, are doing this. But they don't always want to say that. They have a real problem with that boundary. Having come from a long history of activism from the time I was in high school, I can't separate my life out. I can't make up data, but I can say that I will look for objective data that will help people, that will make their lives better. And I really think that more of that should be done, and more of it, often is done. I work on a lot of projects that are funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, one of the NIH institutes. And they've always funded for many years these kinds of projects that are literally collaborations of scientists and activists and sometimes government units as well. And they believe that when you put those people together, they can identify problems and work on them together and produce a lot of really excellent science as well as help people. One of the groups I work with a lot is Silent Spring Institute in Newton, and they were founded by the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition, which clearly is an activist group. They are a scientific body, but in their mission statement, it says that they are doing work with citizens, with citizen input, for the benefit of everybody. And that hasn't tainted their science the way some people say. It actually has made them leaders in science. They have been some of the greatest scholars of exposure science, finding out what chemicals are in our bodies, our household air and dust. Their findings have led to important policy implications. They've never, they've never made up data to do this. They've never gone outside the bounds of the best scientific journals. Indeed, they've published in the American Journal of Public Health, which is the single premier journal of public health. They published in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is the top environmental health journal in the world. They've done great science while doing it in collaboration with activists. And so that's what we want to show as advocacy scientists, that this doesn't mean you go off and just write pamphlets or give interviews to newspapers. It means you do really good science, because if you go back to popular epidemiology, it was the people at the creekside who saw the fish spill. It was the workers in the factory who saw that a lot of people were having miscarriages. It's the people who suffer the problems who call it to attention. And nothing at all in the history of medicine and public health goes against that grain. It's always the ordinary citizens who understand the primary problems. So this is nothing but an extension of that. I think what we just discussed, this question about advocacy science, to what extent should a social scientist be out there in these kinds of collaborations, or even being, members of some of the organizations that they work with. I have never suffered for it. I mean, I've heard criticisms of it. I wouldn't say it's hurt my career. I think that a junior faculty member might be reluctant to do the kind of things that I did. But I think, again, it's also become more acceptable. And many other funding agencies have now begun to fund this kind of community-based participatory research. So not just the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, EPA has done some of this, and now some of the institute-wide calls for proposals from the National Institutes of Health have done this. You even look at an organization like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have a lot of projects that call for citizen collaboration. So it's become increasingly important, and those of us who are the groundbreakers, taking risks at doing it, have helped to open it up so it's more legitimate for a lot of people, including junior faculty. So I've seen, very pleased to see young assistant professors fresh out of graduate school applying for and getting those kind of grants and saying, these are prestigious grants and they are really highly recognizable, and I will do work that will be published in the best of journals, but I will do this working with citizens groups. Well, as we saw in the Bush administration, science was very politicized, so that if you were at all on the side of regulation, you were tossed out. And even things that were written into federal laws were not being complied with. So EPA had certain mandates under the Clean Air Act to look every 5 years at air pollution and publish those reports, and those reports were then supposed to be used for future policy making. The administration shut that down. Scientists were kicked off advisory boards because corporations and industry associations and right-wing think tanks said, oh, this person, is an advocate, they're biased. They automatically believe that secondhand smoke is dangerous without looking at the scientific evidence. And so people were kicked off because they were strong proponents of secondhand smoke being a cause of disease. So if you politicize the agencies, the advisory boards, and you take material off the websites, which was true, EPA was throwing stuff off of its website because they didn't want public awareness of that. All of this work that was done in the Bush administration to politicize science and to deregulate, that we can't have that happen again. We've got to have science-based policy so that when science discovers that smaller air particulate matter is a cause of disease, we have to regulate those smaller particulates. We don't want to see corporations going in and filing suits against the scientists and getting personal records of participants in biomedical research studies and shutting down scientists because they don't like what they're doing. And this happened. My colleague Steve Wing, an epidemiologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, studied the negative effects of hog farming, huge industrial confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs. And he was, really assaulted. The hog industry went to the state legislature and said, look, this is a big industry in our state, and Steve Wing is hurting it. And they forced him to hand over records that should have been private. So the precautionary principle argues that we should take action even when we don't have certain final evidence, because you don't want to wait for long-term epidemiological evidence, the way we had the situation with lung cancer, where it took forever, not because the science wasn't up to it, but because the political opposition and the medical misunderstanding was so great. So within the medical establishment, there was a lot of resistance to lung cancer and its relationship to tobacco. And there was a lot of policy implications of that, because if you started to regulate tobacco, that was a major part of the economy. Likewise with chemicals, they're such a big part of the economy that nobody is wanting to threaten economic interests. But we find all of a sudden that, studies will show us that a chemical shows up where it shouldn't be. We hadn't thought about it before. Example that I like a lot is in Sweden, back around 1999, they discovered a lot of flame retardants, a particular type called PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, in breast milk. In Sweden, like a lot of other countries in Scandinavia, they are always monitoring health and in the environment. They have excellent medical registries. They can track down, DNA over generations. They can look at the heritability of disease, and they keep focus a lot of attention on finding out what's going on around us. And their approach was, this doesn't belong here, and the best thing to do is to get rid of it. So they outlawed PBDEs. They didn't say, well, let's have a long period of funding from our federal agencies to study this. They didn't say, let's have environmental impact assessments, or let's ask the companies, would this hurt their bottom line if we regulated it or banned it? They just said it doesn't belong there. And this breast milk is really important, because this is what women are giving their babies to give them all the immunities to avoid disease. So why should we put this strange chemical into their bodies? So that's what the precautionary principle would say. It's a foreign substance. It doesn't belong there. And we have evidence also that it does things, at least in animal studies, that we didn't have a lot of human data at that point. And the precautionary principle basically says that we've got to take action before the certainty, sometimes because we know that other things in that chemical class have effects, and sometimes because we know it has effects in animals, sometimes because we just know it's very persistent, that it's a kind of chemical that it likes to go into fats. It's lipophilic. And that would necessarily mean that it could, of course, store in places where it hurt people. It will bioaccumulate and stay in their bodies for a long time. It will stay in the dust or in the fish that people eat for a long time. And we don't want those persistent organic pollutants to be in the atmosphere. We're not going to wait for a long experiment that takes decades and decades, an uncontrolled experiment of releasing all these chemicals that don't make sense. And many of these chemicals were designed to do very odd, different kinds of things. And so it doesn't make sense that we're letting this huge array of chemicals in. We have no program for testing them. And with chemicals, we don't have to prove they're safe before we use them. So it's the opposite of what the Food and Drug Administration does, is to say, if you want to put this additive into peanut butter, if you want to put this drug into people's bodies to prevent a disease or cure a disease, you have to show that it's safe and effective. It's the exact opposite with chemicals. The onus is on us to then say, these might be dangerous or they are dangerous. And we don't usually have the wherewithal to do those kinds of studies. They're very expensive, and they often take a long time to do. So the precautionary principle is fairly new. When I began working on this project, contested illnesses project, about 11 years ago, I probably started to write the grant maybe 12 years ago. It's very, very uncommon to hear the term. And there was only a very small handful of people who were thinking about this. A number of people like Joel Tickner and Ken Geiser at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. And they spent a lot of time with European regulators and scientists figuring out that this was an important new direction. They began to bring it to this country and to hold conferences and to bring Europeans over here and to say, you know, we are a protective society. We put more of our gross national product into health and well-being than many other countries. We take seriously protecting public health. So listen to us about this precautionary principle business. And it spread very rapidly. People in this country began to see, maybe this is why there are so many crazy clusters of cancer and other diseases, why there are so many endangered species dying off because of chemical hazards and other kinds of things people are beginning to see here and around the world, that there's something going on in the environment with this post-World War II petrochemical explosion of toxics that are being released. And it just gelled, you know, in people's minds as a great new way to think of things. And it avoided the idea that we have to wait for long-term studies to prove that there's a danger. And it just grew and became very popularly accepted in a fairly short amount of time. Well, I think that the huge daily exposure of many chemicals that we're confronted with, when a lot of the environmental movement began to look at environmental health issues, it was a dump site, Hooker Chemical at Love Canal, or Beatrice and Grace Chemicals up at Woburn, or the proliferation of industrial sites in black communities, hazardous waste facilities, the large emitters of pollution and contamination. I think now it's real important to see that our everyday products that we put on our bodies as cosmetics and deodorants, the products that are in our cleaning fluids, the products that are just released through a whole number of things like the plastic bags that we put in our garbage can, and the clothes that we wear, and the flame retardants that are full in our TVs and our mattresses and our sofas, that there's so much of this going on that no one ever tells us about. And I think calling attention to that and calling attention to the growing scientific discovery that these are causing disease, they are causing changes in our DNA, that they are causing all sorts of damages to the environment. These are important things that I think need to be known. So I see greater regulation of many of these chemicals, and I see enormous attention. Who could have imagined 5 years ago that there would be a large movement focused around bisphenol A? And you know, who would have thought that there would be a whole movement of people just trying to get plastic water bottles removed? Who would have thought that climate justice could generate all this campus activity? Just a few years ago, people would have said that's wishful thinking. So I think what I like to do is to, you know, be part of those innovative things on the forefront and to say, the precautionary principle told us to look at these things. We knew that these things didn't belong there. We knew that they were designed even for the wrong kinds of purposes. And let's go ahead and look at them and see what we can do to act and to change and to get regulation. So I think it's the everyday awareness of the everyday chemicals that are there and don't need to be. Because the same thing that you put on your body as a deodorant in the US with phthalates is sold in Europe without those phthalates. It's just as effective and it's not more costly. Well, obviously, a lot of people try to buy green cleaning products. They try to buy organic foods. They try to use less cleaning products. That, they realize that they don't have to buy products. Half the things that they could need to clean, they could do ammonia and water with. So, yeah, obviously, a lot of education about personal changes in cosmetics and cleaning products and the kinds of products that we use on an everyday basis. But that's never the only solution because we want to actually make it safe for people. We don't want to have to go into the store and hold our phone up and get a barcode read so that it will then take us to a website that says, yes, buy this product. It's been vetted by such and such a green organization. I mean, that's nice if that can happen, but why have those products out there in the first place? There's so many toxic chemicals in our daily lives that don't need to be there. So the average citizen then has to figure out ways to affect policy, sometimes at a very local level, at a state level, at a federal level, and sometimes at shareholder meetings, because corporations often will act even before the government will change policy. So I think the average citizen has to engage in their personal lives with citizens to find out, what can we do together? What are the local problems? How can we form a new organization to change things? How can we ask the city parks department to turn over vacant lots so that we can begin to plant community gardens and talk about the healthful effects of that? How can we help local farmers so that we buy more locally? Keep farming as a good local family industry, and at the same time, use less of a carbon footprint to get food, and get people eating healthier food in getting that food into corner grocery stores. So very local level, but then let's get that into the farm bill too. Let's get, instead of funding tons of dollars to dump milk down drains to keep milk prices stable, instead of getting the agricultural extension folks to teach people how to spray instead of allowing pesticide drift in California to go all over the place and affect so many poor farm workers who don't even have enough washing stations to clean themselves off. Those levels are what we need to be looking at. That's where the biggest change will happen. A woman in Sweden doesn't have to worry about PBDEs showing up in her breast milk. She doesn't have to go and get tested for this. She doesn't have to worry about what products to buy because there's a government looking out for her and saying, we want to be much more precautionary. We want to be much lower on the chain. We don't want to have all these chemicals. And if you don't have to worry yourself, you don't have to have all the anxiety about it, and you don't have to spend all the time doing that research yourself. You shouldn't have to do that all the time. We want people to be educated. We want them to be citizen scientists. We want them to be educated lay people. But they shouldn't spend their whole time both worrying about it and getting that information. It should be a situation where they can affect policy to get as many toxics out of the daily stream of life as they can. It's actually in our economic interest to convince corporations, because they find that if they're going to sell products to Northern Europe, they can't fill them up with the same contaminants that they would like to here. And it winds up being effective, just like we now say green chemistry is one of the waves of the future. Well, let's find ways to make things that are cleaner. If you've got toxic chemicals, you're going to pay a higher insurance liability premium because of handling them. You're going to pay much higher toxic waste disposal fees than if they were non-toxic waste. You're going to have much lower costs for your health insurance for your workers because they will be exposed to less toxic hazards. You'll sell more products because people say you're a green company, you're a good citizen. And it also turns out that this opens up a whole new wave of chemical discoveries. Just as petrochemicals were scientifically, monumental in the post-World War period, yes, there were a lot of amazing discoveries, many of which we now think are harmful when they're used. But green chemistry, which California wisely has a green chemistry initiative to do this, this will be a great new advance. Just like with alternative energy, we'll find wonderful new ways to do science, to do engineering, to make policy, to make things better and cheaper and safer. Well, some corporations are and some are not. I mean, the corporate world is not monolithic any more than government. Some government agencies are much more sympathetic to the kinds of things I've talked about than others. And obviously it changes from one administration to another. Certain corporations are very concerned about climate change. The energy companies are not. I mean, the energy companies are causing a lot of this. But companies that are affected by it, say the insurance industry, not a wonderful actor in many people's eyes, is at odds with the chemical industry and the oil industry over this. And so the idea is to find where are these lacunae, where are these holes, these channels of getting in and showing people you could do something good and it would benefit you. And that, maybe your trade association hasn't agreed yet, but you could be a corporate leader and you could convince them. And you could maybe, increase your market share by being a corporate leader in this area. So yes, many of them are changing, partly by consumer pressure, partly because green chemistry is showing them that they can do things cheaper, cleaner, safer. But it's a very slow process because they've gotten used to things that are being used for decades, and they're afraid of change. They're afraid, can we give this product up today? Will we lose market share? The flame retardant industry, for example, tells the manufacturers of electronics, if you don't add our flame retardants to your computers and monitors, well, we'll find a way to let people know that your computers aren't as fire safe. Well, they don't need to be full of these flame retardants, and indeed a very international collaboration of scientists and scholars and activists and government agencies convinced the International Electronics Association to not add all of these. But if you have a small number of corporations with a lot of power pushing it, then it becomes harder to do that. Sometimes California has this very stringent fire safety standard, and you'll pick up a tag on the bottom of your chair, and it'll see, this meets California TB 117, Technical Bulletin 117 for flame retardants. It's like a Texas school textbook, right? School market is so big there that if they don't want you to talk about evolution in Texas textbooks, well, the textbook manufacturers don't want to do two different textbooks, one for Texas and one for Oklahoma. Well, maybe Oklahoma is not a good example. But so then you're going to get this watered down anti-evolution textbook. And then you're going to get flame retardants in products all over the country because nobody wants to have to manufacture the thing twice. This was good when it was California air emission standards for cars. It is not good when it's flame retardant standards. But again, it's that kind of, sometimes one actor, one state. Here's a place where you've got a state that leads in emission standards. The Clean Air Act was pioneered by what California had done. California is great on a lot of things. And even under a Republican governor, they try to go very green in a lot of ways. The first green chemistry initiative, the first state biomonitoring program to look at toxics in people's bodies, but also at the same time, a retrograde policy in terms of flame retardants. I didn't have an academic mentor in terms of the environment. But I had a wonderful graduate school mentor, Irv Zola, who died at a young age. And he worked in the field of medical sociology. And he taught me how you have to use your own embodied experience to understand a larger problem. He was a leader in looking at the social causes of illness and the importance of social stress and the importance of direct engagement between people, at the honesty of doctor-patient relationships. And later in his career began to look at disability and was one of the founders of the area of disability studies, and wrote a wonderful book called Missing Pieces, in which he came to grips with his own disability. He had polio as a child with a lot of after effects, and then was in a terrible car crash, and as a result had legs that really couldn't get him around. So he was most of his life on half-arm crutches. But he never thought about that, and he never wrote about that. He was a great scholar of everything else in medical sociology, one of the founders of the field. And when he came to realize the embodiment that this had meant to him, he went over and spent a bunch of time in the Netherlands in an entire village created for people with disabilities. And he then understood the intersection between the lived personal embodied experience, the groupness of when people begin to realize this together and help each other to form organizations to change the world, and the policy that needs to be done, the way that caregivers, health professionals need to understand this and reframe their understanding of the world. And so he didn't really know much about the environment. And I think he was exactly the kind of mentor I needed, even if he didn't teach me about the environment, because he really put together all of those different elements and helped me then to transpose that from looking at medical and mental health topics to then begin looking at environmental health topics. Then I had a more distant mentor, Lois Gibbs, really who we think of as the founder of the modern environmental movement, who, by launching what she did at Love Canal, was just a great role model. And we've been friends and colleagues over the years, and even though she, as you may have seen, she wrote a foreword to the book, she was never the academic mentor, but she was the social mentor, and I think that we all need a person like that. Well, I think Sandra Steingraber's book, Living Downstream, that we talked about before, because she also does this thing that I talked about, taking her own embodied experience of living with cancer and trying to figure out where could it have come from, looking at her friend's cancer, looking at Rachel Carson's life and the difficulties that she had with the corporate world, with the government world, and with the scientific world, making known what she had found. And also because, like Rachel Carson, it synthesizes so much knowledge and puts it together in a way that the average person can read it and understand it and make sense of it, and has the courage to say, I am a biologist, but I'm going to write for an audience that's beyond just the biology audience. I want to write for an educated lay public and make my message known. And the way she weaves stories in and out, her story, her friend's story, Rachel Carson's story, the way she looks at the different media, the air, the water, the soil, the way she uses her poet's voice, the way she uses her rich narrative voice. It's a beautiful combination. And I think it grabs people an awful lot. And this is a woman who is so skilled that she not only writes and teaches about the environment, but she teaches writing workshops. So I think when people read the book, they don't just read the book, they learn about a person. And the wonderful movie that was done about this book is a great example too. In terms of a single movie, I'm not sure. I mean, I think Erin Brockovich is probably the most wonderful movie because it shows, like we see with so many toxic activists, a very ordinary citizen discovering through their own hard detective work what needs to be done, and challenging authority and being willing to take chances and to really shake and move a lot of people. And I think it's also wonderful because, it's such a gutsy person. And, that really is what the Ann Andersons and the Lois Gibbs of this world are like. And the people that I work with today in toxic groups, they're like that. They're really gutsy. They're usually women. They're women who get into this usually because they're worried about their kids' health, and their kids, in fact, may have become ill. And I admire that kind of portrayal. I think that they did a great job in that movie. Also, it was the kind of thing that just shocked me so much that it would become such a popular movie, because it was really, I thought, so controversial. That's a very hard kind of question, because I like to go back and say that the first work that impelled a lot of us to do environmental sociology as a field was a book by Kai Erikson called Everything in Its Path. And it was about the Buffalo Creek flood in Appalachia. And if you remember, there was this dam burst at an impoundment of coal ash a year or two ago in Appalachia. It was a kind of similar thing. But this was a book that looked at the history of Appalachia. It looked at the poor corporate practices of the mining company, and it looked at this ordinary community devastated by the problem. And it told us that we need to have a whole new approach to looking at disaster, and that the average everyday disaster was not a natural disaster, but it was a human-made or human-exacerbated disaster. And it's a beautifully written book, also very poetic, by a man who was very well recognized in his field even before, and then became more so after, was president of the American Sociological Association. But it was mainly because it was a book that put so many of us on the path of looking at environmental sociology. So it wasn't about toxic waste in the same sense. I think one of the early books that came out around the same time as mine, I mentioned the book about Love Canal by Adeline Levine, was a very powerful book. Michael Edelstein wrote a book called Contaminated Communities, and he and I were both working on this area of research at the same time. I had a chance to look at some of his work in draft form, and helped me think through a lot of issues, and it had a lot of impact on many other people, helping them to take some of the lessons of Kai Erikson's book and now apply it specifically to contamination sites. Well, I think the one I started with, No Safe Place, even though it's now old, I did get a chance to revise it, to update it at the time of Jonathan Harr's book, A Civil Action. And Jonathan Harr kindly wrote an introduction to my book, to my new edition. But I think in a way it's foundational. A lot of people have used it, even if this sounds immodest, to study contaminated communities, toxic activism. It's dated in the sense that it talks about a lot of other sites and other EPA issues and other policy issues at the time that would be less familiar to people. And that would make me want people to read Toxic Exposures, my book that just came out a year or two ago instead, because it's more up to date, and it would just sound more familiar to people. But I guess they're a pair and they fit together nicely, sandwiched with a number of years. My whole environmental health career is sandwiched in between those two books. It's hard to say one. Lois Gibbs, for years, was the pioneer with her CHEJ, the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, which is a national group that helps local citizens organizations get the technical expertise and the political skills and organizing skills they need, and has been a beacon for a lot of people at a national level. But then there's a similar group at a local level, Toxics Action Center, which is a New England-wide group that does a lot of similar kind of things. I admire very much the local organizations that I partner with in a number of grants and projects. A group called the Environmental Justice League of Rhode Island, and another group called ENACT, the Environmental Neighborhood Awareness Committee of Tiverton, which is a town about 20 miles to the east of here, just south of Fall River. So we work on a lot of different projects together. With ENACT, we work together to help them deal with the cleanup of a massive contamination that's made their land so unusable that the town had a moratorium on digging. They couldn't fix a foundation, plant a bush, play on the soil, or do anything of that sort. With the Environmental Justice League of Rhode Island, after we finish this interview, I'm going to be going over to our community environmental college. We run high school classes during the summer. We've got 2 8-week classes, one on environmental justice, another on food justice. And the students are, besides learning, they're doing projects. So they're doing corner store makeovers where they help local grocery stores build new shelves, bring in fruit and vegetables, mostly from local growers, and have fairs and festivals and educational things, and help them grow their business while also making the neighborhood healthier and showing people that they can do fairly successful things without a lot of money, without a large organization, but with a deep awareness. And so these are groups that just do an enormous amount of wonderful local work. And there are hundreds and hundreds of those kind of groups all over the country. I could spend hours just giving you little thumbnails of the many different groups, but those are just a few of them.